The geneticist says we have a record.
We have a record for engineering any vertebrate.
The geneticist says there are about 2,000 pigs. They're fairly healthy, getting close to a year survival. And the nice thing is,
They grow like regular pigs. They grow.
it's like a new strain of pig. It's called Pig 3.0. Pig 3.0, does it look different? I mean, they could make it look different. They have another project. They're making an animal that looks different. Are we creating a new kind of relative between the human and the pig? Are we reconnecting the tree of life? I shower and put on a fresh pair of underwear, a polo shirt, and pants from the supply closet. I'd been warned, you have to shower coming in and going out. Coming in, not to infect the pigs. Going out, because the stench will follow you home. Tucked away in the woods outside Munich, hidden down a small country road, they work in an old farmhouse. It's the place you would least expect to be a cutting-edge, cloning laboratory. On January 5th, 2015, geneticist George Church of Harvard Medical School announced he and his colleagues had used the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology to inactivate 62 porcine endogenous retroviruses in pig embryos. When I met Dr. Church, he told me that the company he started to genetically engineer pigs as human organ donors, eGenesis, held the record for engineering any vertebrate, and they called it Pig 3.0. We put on tall boots, open a heavy metal door, and walk into the pens. They hear us immediately, and the quiet is over. The sound now, the sound and the smell, the sound of desperation, crying, screaming. They will sound like that until they get fed, the veterinarian says. They are excited. Me, overwhelmed, intimidated, consumed by my senses, but also excited. I've been reading about these pigs for months, and finally, I can meet them. We go from pen to pen, meeting pigs designed for different purposes. Micro mini pigs, engineered to be small. Diabetic pigs, engineered to be sick. And xenopigs, engineered to be more human. In the next room, I can see the heads of the pigs above the tops of their pens. These are the oldest pigs. The size of them. They glare at us with angry eyes. Some grunt, some scream with a loudness of 600 pounds. I wince. The vet is unbothered. We continue. This one is friendly, he says, unlocking the gate and entering the pen. I stay outside, safely behind the open gate. The enormous pig stands halfway up and affectionately greets the vet, rubbing against him as he strokes his head, drooling wet kisses with his nose, and nibbling gently on his clothes and boots. The enormity of the creature and the gentle, affectionate obedience he displays feels like a window into the whole story of the pig, and how they came to be pigs and not wild boars. The deal we struck 10 millennia ago, consistent food for them, consistent food for us, security for good behavior. We have already, and we will continue to open up new avenues of selection that might actually create breeds that are so different. We might have to ask, are these different species?
Are these different species?
People will point home, and the pig from afar, lightly at the cost of being different species. We have been breeding animals for so long. This is not something new at all. What we're doing is accelerating evolution. You're making that relation between time and evolution faster.
The branches on this phylogenetic tree become longer and longer in a process that goes faster and faster.
The biologist says the mini pigs were bred to be small. After generations of breeding, they were bred to be small. They're useful for biomedical research because, they're so close to humans, but they're smaller, so less housekeeping. I said, let's go for a walk in the woods. As I walk down the wooded path from the farmhouse to the pigs, there's a point where the smell hits me suddenly, but not intensely, and I think, that's not so bad. I can handle this. But then, stepping out of the shower with clean, wet hair, it washes over me, this musky, animalic, but deeply familiar smell. There's a moment of horror, of thinking I might be sick, I might have to flee. But I choke it down, and I go on. And soon, I don't even notice. In the last room, in the last pen, I meet the Xeno piglets from the Auckland Islands. Dark and furry, social and friendly, they greet us immediately, smelling us, nibbling our boots as we enter the pen. The vet opens the door, and the pigs run free. They move in a group, always together, back and forth, faster and faster. They become more and more rambunctious, like children at recess, timid at first, but eventually losing all restraint, shitting and running and chewing. They are absolutely charming. And they look at me, they look into the camera with a gaze that sees me. These are what I came for. These are the pigs that are genetically modified to grow human hearts. The 2015 guideline on the regulation of genetically engineered animals containing heritable recombinant DNA constructs from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration identifies 6 broad categories of genetically engineered animals in development. 1. To enhance production or food quality traits, e.g., pigs with less deleterious wastes, faster growing fish. 2. To improve animal health, e.g., disease resistance. 3. Products intended for human therapeutic use, e.g., pharmaceutical products or tissues for transplantation, sometimes referred to as biofarm animals. 4. To enrich or enhance the animal's interaction with humans, e.g., hypoallergenic pets. 5. To develop animal models for human disease, e.g., pigs as models for cardiovascular diseases. 6. To produce industrial or consumer products, e.g., fibers for multiple uses. In other words, we're engineering animals for generations to come. Animals that are bigger, healthier, tastier. Animals that make better, enhanced pets. Animals we can test human medicine on or use directly as donors for human organs. The first pig-to-human heart transplant has already taken place. In January 2022, David Bennett Sr. received a pig heart. He'd been convicted decades earlier of stabbing a man in a jealous rage. David Bennett lived 2 months with his transplant. Then, he became infected by porcine viruses. They were buried deep in his heart. Are you still other? If you become closer and closer to me?
We can do it once it's accepted. We need money, we need the permit. You need a lot of patience, but we have that.
In ancient Rome, when the priest performed the animal sacrifice, slaughtering a bull, a sheep, and a pig to purify and bless the land, he whispered in the animal's ear,
"This deed was done by all the gods. I did not do it. This deed was done by all the gods. I did not do it."
But, as Dr. Bruno Reichardt, heart surgeon, said, it's up to us. For now, for the thousands who made the sacrifice they could not choose, this last act is for the pigs. This deed was done by all of us.